Hello everybody, this is Sir Jet and welcome to another episode of the History Lectures. Today we will have part 2 of the lesson on the Bangsamoro people, the Sultanate of Sulu, and the indigenous people of the Philippines. Last time we focused on the history of the Bangsamoro people and we also touched on the indigenous people of the Philippines. Today we will focus on the Sultanate of Sulu. Now, aside from the Muslim separatist movement in Mindanao, there is another very interesting story from that land. It's about the Sultanate of Sulu and our claim on Sabah. This may be the first time that you will hear these stories. So hold on to your seats and let's get started. This is a very interesting lesson because this isn't really taught in your regular history classes in high school or in elementary. And it really took me a lot of time researching on this when I was already a grown man. I haven't really heard much about this when I was a little boy. My father mentioned about this when I was a little boy, but I have very few details at that time. So I made my own research and I'm going to present it to you today. The Sabah issue and the war in Mindanao are actually interconnected. It's one big story actually, and it's quite intricate, so you have to listen very carefully. Okay, now let us begin the story with the golden age of the Sultanate of Sulu. This is a very old kingdom during the pre-colonial times. Before the coming of the Spaniards, Sulu was a very prominent kingdom. This is the island of Sulu. It's a very small island in the Philippines. It's even smaller than the main island of Mindanao. But during pre-colonial times, this is a very rich kingdom and famous also in the whole of Southeast Asia because traders go to that giant palenque. The traders would come from all over Asia, from as far as ancient Thailand to the ancient islands of Indonesia and Malacca, and also from Cambodia and Vietnam. There were kingdoms there in the old times that had their trade connections with the Sultanate of Sulu. And this is the scope of the Sultanate of Sulu. It includes Palawan, the Spratly Islands, half of Mindanao, and this large territory here shaped like a big bad wolf. It's called Sabah today. So that is the scope of the very progressive kingdom of Sulu, and their ruler is called a sultan, and it is an Islamic kingdom, so the religion was Islam. How did this little island kingdom of Sulu got this very big land, Sabah? Originally, it's not part of the Sultanate, but one day the Sultan of Sulu got Sabah as part of his kingdom. Now here's the story. The Sultanate of Brunei and the Sultanate of Sulu were really close because the two sultans were actually relatives, cousins. So this is Sabah. On this side, you see this little kingdom here, color gray. That is Brunei, and that's a separate sultanate. And over here on this side, you have the island of Sulu. Now, the original owner of Sabah is the Sultan of Brunei. Now, these are just representative pictures because the camera was not yet invented in that time. So I'm just trying to use some representative pictures so you will have a better understanding. So the Sultan of Brunei and the Sultan of Sulu were cousins. They were relatives. And one day, the Sultan of Brunei had trouble. There was a coup d'etat in his kingdom, and he was able to ask help just in time from his cousin, the Sultan of Sulu. And the Sultan of Sulu sent soldiers to help the Sultan of Brunei. And so there was peace once again in Brunei. This guy was so happy for the help given him by his cousin, and as a token of his appreciation, he gave this very big piece of land to him. For the next many years, that piece of land called Sabah, or North Borneo in their time, was ruled by the Sultan of Sulu. And so the people in Sulu went to Sabah, the people of Sabah went to Sulu, and they intermingled because they're just one big kingdom together under the leadership of the Sultan of Sulu. And so they treat one another as family. The people from Sabah, the people from Sulu, they're one big happy family under the leadership of the Sultan of Sulu. Now, how did we lose Sabah? Now, the Sultan of Sulu has been ruling that place for so long, and then one day he lost control of Sabah. Now, it happened in 1878. There's a European named Gustav Overbeck and a British citizen named Alfred Dent. They were businessmen, and they came to Southeast Asia and rented Sabah from the Sultan of Sulu because they saw the land, it's very rich, and they can make a lot of money out of it. They asked permission from the owner of the land, the Sultan Sulu, if they could rent, R-E-N-T, rent Sabah. And the Sultan of Sulu agreed. There was a contract. They signed it. And when you say rent, that means the original owner is still the original owner. The Europeans who came along would pay the rent money to the Sultan when the Sultan would die to his descendants until the end of time. That's what was written in the contract. And then later on, these two Europeans, Overbeck and Dent, turned over their rights on Sabah to the British Crown. That means they had a property that they rent, and then they gave that property or that contract to the British, at that time, Queen. It's now the British government who owns Sabah, beginning that point in time. They were the ones administering the business in the land of Sabah. Here is Sabah on a larger picture. So the Philippines is over there, Sabah is here, and then we have a place called Sarawak, and this place, Peninsular Malaysia, was once upon a time called Malaya. Why am I showing you that map? Because aside from Sabah, the British Crown also colonized other territories in Southeast Asia. Sarawak, okay, this land south of Sabah, and this pink area over here, it's called Malaya, and a little island south of Malaya, Singapore. Okay, so remember, 1, 2, 3, 4. Singapore, Malaya, Sarawak, Sabah. And after World War II, the British started freeing its colonies, giving them independence. And instead of making 4 countries, they made just one country out of Sarawak, Singapore, Malaya, and Sabah. And together, they call this Malaysia. Okay, or the Federation of Malaysia. Later, Singapore said, we don't want to be part of Malaysia, so let us be a separate country. And Malaysia agreed, so Malaysia gave up Singapore. So today, Singapore is a separate country, while the remainder of Malaysia, Malaya, Sarawak, and Sabah. Amazing. Now, Sabah is a new country together with other territories of the British, separate from the Philippines. And this is the time wherein the Philippines is already a modern country also. We had our independence after World War II also. If you're the descendant of the Sultan of Sulu, and you see your land that you rented out to a British guy, and now it's now part of another country, not your country, naturally, what would you feel? What would you do? The descendants of the Sultan, being Filipino citizens now, okay, because Sulu is now part of Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, and they are part of the Republic of the Philippines, they ask help from their president. And at that time, the president of the Philippines was Diosdado Macapagal. And Diosdado Macapagal, wanting to help his fellow Filipino, the Sultan, went to the United Nations to protest the inclusion of Sabah in the new country called Malaysia. Actually, he had approached Malaysia first and told him, hey, return Sabah to us. It belongs to a Filipino, the Sultan of Sulu. Here's the contract, you can see it. And then Malaysia wouldn't give up Sabah. The funny thing is, the government of Malaysia is still paying the Sultan of Sulu the amount of 77,000 pesos per year for the rental of Sabah in accordance to the contract signed in 1878. So the descendants of the Sultan, they are dividing among themselves the 77,000 pesos. And there are at least 9 official claimants to the 77,000 pesos, and their children and grandchildren. So that's a very, very small amount compared to the vast area that Sabah occupies. It's very large, probably as large as Mindanao, or as large as the whole island of Luzon. And Malaysia wouldn't give it up. Why? Because there are lots and lots of resources there. Oil included. Malaysia is a rich country, richer than the Philippines. And one of the things that makes Malaysia rich is the industries in Sabah. Aside from oil, Sabah is also known for their rubber plantations. Malaysia is the #1 rubber producer in the world. And so if we have Sabah, then the Philippines would be a rich country. But sad to say, we don't own it anymore. And it's in Malaysia's hands. And the people living in Sabah, having born and growing up with the Malaysian flag in their consciousness, so they see themselves as Malaysians and not Filipinos. That's the sad part. We lost Sabah. That was during the time of Macapagal. He couldn't do anything to get Sabah back in Philippine boundary lines. Now, the next president after Macapagal was Marcos. And during Marcos's time, he had a grand plan to invade Sabah. There's a saying, if you can't get it by hook, you get it by crook. In Tagalog, ang hindi makuha sa santong dasalan, kuhanin sa santong paspasan. Marcos saw that his predecessor, Macapagal, couldn't get Sabah through diplomatic or peaceful means, then might as well get it in a violent way. Okay? So he had a secret plan. It's a secret because you want to do a surprise attack on the Malaysians to grab Sabah. So nobody should know about this plan. It's a secret. And he called it Oplan Merdeka. How does this work? Marcos plans to recruit and train young Moro men from Sulu. make them secret agents, and they would infiltrate Sabah. Just like the movie Salt. I don't know if you have watched that movie. If you haven't watched that yet, I recommend that you watch it. You will put your secret agents in Sabah society, and they will be disguised there as ordinary people. And they must come from Sulu. They must be Moro. Why? Because, as I told you a while ago, the people of Sabah and the people of Sulu treat each other as family. They were relatives long time ago. Up to the present, they still consider one another as close relatives. They speak the same language. They have the same religion. They have the same traditions. So, if somebody from Sulu goes to Sabah, he would be very welcome. Nobody would suspect him to be doing something bad. So, you can go to Sabah and be a businessman, or a taho vendor, a tricycle driver, or a teacher, and the people of Sabah would not suspect anything. So that's the plan, Marcos. You train these Moro men to be secret agents, and they would do commando operation. They would be there disguised as a taho vendor, tricycle driver, or even a school teacher, and in a twinkling of an eye, snap of a finger, like that, they would shed off their disguise, and they would simultaneously attack and kill the key officials in Sabah, like the police commander, the mayors of the towns, and other officials. They would get them at gunpoint. They would be unsuspecting because maybe the mayor is just buying taho from the vendor. The policeman is just talking to a tricycle driver, and then suddenly they have guns, and then they have uniforms under their disguise, and now they got Sabah instantly. Sabah would fall into the hands of these commandos, and Sabah is now Philippine territory. Fantastic! Amazing! Isn't that a brilliant plan coming from a genius? That's the plan of Marcos, Oplan Merteca. Now, there's a hitch in the plan. When Marcos had gathered recruits from Sulu, promised to be members of the elite forces of the AFP, okay, they were brought for training on the island of Corregidor. Okay, so you know where Corregidor is, right? It's in Manila Bay. I drew the map in our lesson during the Japanese occupation. At this time, Corregidor was a training ground of the military. And so they brought the new recruits there. The recruits were shocked when they were oriented of their mission. They wouldn't do and couldn't do what Marcos wanted them to do. They wouldn't attack and kill their brothers in Sabah, because they were the same people. They treat each other as family. They have the same tradition, language, religion, and they wouldn't do that to a fellow brother. So they had a mutiny. They protested against their officers, and they wanted to go back home and just quit on the mission. But there's no turning back. They already knew the plan. It might spill out, and Malaysia might get ready for such an attack. So they cannot just go home just like that. They were massacred in Corregidor. These young Moro recruits. And the plan to attack Sabah was no more, because the government cannot recruit anymore from anywhere. How about the trainees that were massacred? They were just buried there. Okay? And it was a secret for a long time. The massacre that happened in Corregidor. And we call that the Javida Massacre. Now the secret spilled out after some time, because there is a former journalist turned senator who knew about the massacre and who also knew about the plan to invade Sabah. Because he's a former journalist, so he must have the journalist's nose. he's nosy on a lot of things. And he got to find out this plan to invade Sabah. And he revealed this to the public in a shocking speech in Marawi City, in the heart of Mindanao. He told the audience, ladies and gentlemen, be careful about our president. Be careful of our president. He has a military mind. This is not yet martial law, but the character of Marcos being militaristic is already being observed by this senator. And he said, you know what? This president of ours wanted to invade Sabah. And in fact, he recruited young Moro men from you, from your people, and massacred them because they wouldn't want to go to Sabah. And who is this senator? You know him. Benigno Aquino Jr., alias Ninoy. Marcos's #1 critic. He's the husband of Cory Aquino, the father of Noy Noy and Chris Aquino, and the grandfather of Bim Bim. So, after hearing the speech, the Moros got angry at the government. They took up arms and made a group, a separatist group, and wanted to separate Mindanao from the Philippines. And how? Through arms. And that's the beginning of the conflict in Mindanao, the armed conflict in Mindanao. It began in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, after the speech of Ninoy. And the first group that was formed was the MNLF, Moro National Liberation Front. And that's their leader, Nur Miswari. That's their flag. They have a flag ready. Okay? Once they get independence, that will be the flag that they will use for the new country that they will call Bangsamoro. And later on, another group was formed, the MILF, or Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So now there are two groups in Mindanao fighting the government of the Philippines. And their objective is to put up a new republic in Mindanao. And they also wanted to include Palawan. So imagine the map of the Philippines. You detach Palawan and Mindanao, and they become a new country called Bangsamoro. And it was a bloody war that happened next. Hundreds, thousands of soldiers and Bangsamoro fighters fighting and dying, and civilians getting caught in the crossfire, evacuating from their homes. It's terrible, you know. When I was a little boy, I would hear stories about a neighbor of ours who only had one arm. And they say he was a soldier in Mindanao and he lost his arm fighting in that place. There were also stories that cargo planes would land in Mindanao, in Manila, coming from Mindanao, and would be carrying several coffins of dead soldiers. And this happens every day. And so Mindanao became a big, bloody battlefield because of the speech of Ninoy, which is based on the plan to invade Sabah. So that is the connection. The war is ongoing up to now in little bits and pieces, but it was the strongest, or it was in full swing in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Okay? And it's also strong during the 80s, even during the EDSA time, and in the early years of Cory Aquino. During the time of President Ramos, this was in 1996, peace was forged with the MNLF. Finally, there was a ray of hope that the Muslims and the Filipinos, the Filipino Christians, would have a peaceful environment in Mindanao. And how did that happen? There was an organization called the ARMM. Okay? It was created to appease the MNLF. It's like a region in Mindanao, carved out, okay, separated from the rest of Mindanao. And they would have their own leaders who are Muslims. And they would come from the MNLF leadership. The people would vote who among the MNLF leaders would be their governor who would rule the ARMM. The meaning of autonomy is that they have the right now to make laws in their region. And it doesn't necessarily be under, they will not necessarily be under direct command of the government in Manila. That's the meaning of autonomy. Okay? It's just like in the old days when you would live in a dorm. You live in a faraway province, you're studying, you live in a dorm, so you have your own place, you have your own budget, you're away from your family, you can make your own rules in your dorm. Okay? You can go home anytime at night. You can wake up anytime you want. You can do whatever you want with your money. That is autonomy. But you are still the child of your parent. ARMM is still part of the Republic of the Philippines. But they have that degree of freedom, and that is a nice setup. The MNLF took it, okay, and then they agreed to have the peace in Mindanao. So they surrendered their guns. They will not go to jail. They became citizens that are peace-loving. Their leaders became the leaders of the ARMM. And there was peace in Mindanao during the time of President Ramos. But the next president, Joseph Estrada, there was trouble that happened during his time. Now, the other Muslim separatist group, the MILF, was actually left out in the ARMM deal. So they continued their armed struggle. Now, this is seems to be a smaller group compared to the MNLF, but things became worse when ERAP declared an all-out war versus the MILF in the year 2000. There was another group in Mindanao that is not a separatist group. They're just a kidnap group, the Abu Sayyaf. They're not after independence in Mindanao. They're just after money by kidnapping engineers and teachers and tourists and priests. Now, this Abu Sayyaf group was closely identified with the MILF. They had the same mountain hideout, and then many people claim that the MILF was protecting them, or they are relatives with the MILF. Because of that, ERAP declared an all-out war. He was chasing the Abu Sayyaf, and he said, okay, not only Abu Sayyaf, but also MILF. Let's pulverize them. And so there was an all-out war in 2000. So war broke out again during the time of ERAP. A big all-out war. Now, during the time of GMA, a ceasefire was arranged with the MILF. And it is still enforced up to today. Okay, so there was a lull in the fighting in Mindanao. MNLF is taken care of by the ARMM. MILF taken care of by the ceasefire. Ceasefire means time out. Okay? It's not really the end of the fight. It's just a time out. And the time out endured up to the time of Pinoy. Now, during the time of Pinoy, the government tried to hatch another deal with the MILF. And their deal was labeled BBL, not Blackboard Learn, but Bangsamoro Basic Law. And it says that the BBL says that a larger autonomous region would be created in Mindanao, larger than the ARMM. So that means it would include more places. And probably Palawan would be included also. And the personalities who would be the leaders of this larger Bangsamoro region would be MILF personalities. Okay, they would be the key leaders. This BBL would have their own lawmakers, they would have their own Senate, separate from our Senate, who would make pro-Islamic laws. Like in Islam, their holy day is Friday, so that means their weekend is, I think, Thursday, Friday, right? And then Saturday to Wednesday, that's their working week. So they can do that if they want. They can have their own police force, their own mayors and provincial administrators. And this is the most shining part of the deal. A budget would come from Malacanang, from the government in Manila, amounting to 70 billion pesos per year for them to use in their region. And that's a very, very big amount. In exchange for peace. Lay down your arms, no more fighting, let's have peace, here's the money, improve Mindanao, it's under your care. Okay? But you are still under the Republic of the Philippines. Okay? You are just an autonomous region. During the time that this was being processed or debated upon in Congress, there is a Senator, Bongbong Marcos, he's the son of Ferdinand Marcos, claims that he has a better version of the Bangsamoro bill because he said he is including not only the Bangsamoro people but also the Lumads. Because the BBL of Pinoy is just focusing on the Bangsamoro, the Muslim people. But the non-Muslim indigenous people, the Lumads, are not included. Bongbong said, let's include them. He said not only the Lumads but also the Sultanate of Sulu. And there's another Sultanate, the Sultanate of Maguindanao and the Sultanate of Lanao. Might as well include them in the deal. So at least now we can see that our lawmakers are considering the IP, okay, the indigenous people of the Philippines, the minorities, okay, others call them. During the Duterte administration, what happened? The BBL was finally approved and it's now known as the BOL or the Bangsamoro Organic Law. It covers more places than the old ARMM but not very big because Palawan is not included. But at least it's now in orbit. So we have peace in Mindanao at the moment because so far so good. The BOL is working. No more battles or anything violent that we hear in the news coming from the separatist movements in Mindanao. MILF, MNLF. Everybody is at peace in Mindanao right now. Now, the Maute group that attacked Marawi a few years ago is not MILF. It's not MNLF. It's a totally different group. It's a terrorist group linked to the Middle East group, the ISIS. So it's not part of the story. It's not related to what I have discussed. So far, the BOL that I'm talking about covers the old separatist groups that we had in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It puts an orbit to a new framework for peace in Mindanao and Sulu. And the question, the big question is, will the BOL finally establish lasting peace, a peace that will last forever? We pray, yes, we pray that it will be the solution, or it is the solution for the peace in Mindanao. Let us try to continue to make our brothers and sisters in Mindanao, the Muslims, the Lumads, feel that they are Filipinos, that we love them, that we don't look down on them, that we treat them equally, we look at them as brother, as sister, so that we will have national unity. That is the objective why we are studying this course, why we are studying social sciences, so that we will have harmony in the Philippines. Now, last part of this lesson, you might be asking, what happened to Sabah? Okay. So we have talked about the peace in Mindanao. Okay, so how about Sabah that is still in Malaysian's hands? Here is the postlude. There was an invasion of Sabah that happened just recently in 2013. How old were you in 2013? Were you reading the news at that time? Now, it was during the Pinoy administration that a claimant of the throne of the Sultan of Sulu, I say claimant because you don't really call him officially Sultan, because there are several people claiming to be the official Sultan of Sulu. After the real Sultan, the last official Sultan died, his next in line isn't really very clear. So there are many people, at least 3 houses, who want to be called Sultan. So one of them, okay, his name is Jamalul Kiram III, ordered his men, and he called his group the Royal Sulu Army. Okay, they are around 200, to take over his land in Lahad Datu, Sabah. Lahad Datu is a city in Sabah. So they landed there, and they put up the flag of the Sultanate of Sulu. The one that you see in the background. Okay, it has yellow, red, and green trim. And the Sultan was actually in Quiapo. He was an old man, and he's very sick. He's actually dying at this time. He's having dialysis. At least before he died, he wanted to see Sabah back into Philippine territory. So he ordered his men, numbering 200, to camp in Sabah. And they were armed. See? They have guns with them. And they put their flag in Sabah and said, "This is Philippine territory now. We're claiming it because we are the men of Sabah." And it was called a standoff, because the Malaysian military also reacted and surrounded the place and said, "Bring down your arms. You are in Malaysian territory." And they say, "No, we are claiming it for the Sultan of Sulu." And there was no firing yet. So it's called a standoff. Like in chess, like a stalemate. The world turned their eyes on this issue, and the Philippine president was under the microscope. And he didn't want to offend Malaysia because of the great economic benefits that our citizens would get from Malaysia. There are so many OFWs working in Malaysia. If the Malaysians get offended, if Pinoy would support the landing forces of the Sultan, then the backlash might be on our OFWs. They might get maltreated by their Malaysian employers, or even sent back home to the Philippines, or jailed. That would really hurt several families and millions of individuals, the relatives of those OFWs. And that would be a big dent in our economy. So Pinoy, what he did was, he scolded the Sultan. And he told Jamalul Kiram III, "Tell your men, go home. I don't want to offend Malaysia. They're a very good neighbor. What are you doing? This is such a disgrace. Okay, tell your men to go home." And then you know what? The Sultan answered Pinoy, "What home are you talking about? Sabah is our home." Wow, very dramatic words. And so that means the Sultan wouldn't withdraw his forces, so the Malaysian police fired their guns and pulverized the 200 members of the Sulu Royal Army. Many died. Some escaped. But in other words, the standoff was solved violently. Malaysia got Sabah once again. Sabah is still in Malaysia's hands today. A few months later, the Sultan died. He died of old age. Now, his daughter, Princess Jaisel Kiram, she continues to lobby for the recovery of our lost territory up to today. And one thing she did was to run for senator in 2016. But she lost. I think she was not very popular, a virtual unknown. So, you see in the ballot, Jaisel Kiram, who is this? So, nobody knew about her and her advocacy. This story of Sabah being part of the Philippines is not really taught that often in schools. So nobody knew about this, about her. And she lost. If this story would not be taught anymore in Philippine history classes, then give us another 50 years, 100 years, Sabah would be totally lost. It will be just a forgotten story. The next generation Filipinos will never know that Sabah was once upon a time Philippine territory. That's why we are teaching this in school, so that you can teach this to your children, and your children can teach this to their children, and to the next generation. At least the story will live on. If we cannot get Sabah in our time, in our generation, who knows, maybe in the future, it will be returned to the Philippines. The important thing is the story must live on. Okay, so it has been a long lesson. I'll give you time to absorb everything you heard today. And I hope that this would make you a better citizen after hearing all the lectures in our online class. I hope you're a better Filipino now. Okay? So, don't go away. We will have one last meeting. So, don't be absent on that meeting. Alright? So, this is Sir Jet saying goodbye and see you next time.